For those on the call, I am John Hedstrom. As of Tuesday, I'm now the territory executive for the New England Territory for the ALS Association, formerly the executive director of the Massachusetts chapter. Organization is undergoing some significant change in our operating model. I come to you today as an advocate. We here in Massachusetts have been fighting against ICER and QALY for some time. We are working on a bill, H201 and S753 for those who are keeping track here in Massachusetts, working with the Epilepsy Foundation, PIPC, as well as the Disability Policy Consortium. You all are about to have a similar bill here in Connecticut, or at least that's the hopes. Rep. Joe Gresko, with the session that starts February 9th, is looking to be the lead, hopefully. Similar, the bill would seek to prohibit any agency in Connecticut from using a QALY or a quality adjusted life year as a metric for with regard to determining whether a drug is covered and paid for. From the ALS standpoint, you can probably figure out on your own. We look at it from a discriminatory aspect. The QALY scale, if used, particularly for those with advanced ALS, we have folks who would be considered deader than dead, for lack of a better term. And so how we measure the usefulness of a drug and what it means to a person with ALS within the ICER model doesn't seem to work. This is very timely. Just today, ICER actually announced that they are going to review Amylyx's AMX 035, which is the brand new drug that is working to come to market here in the US. This is the first new ALS drug in 2+ decades. And so we take this very seriously. I also sit on the public policy committee within the ALS Association, and I know that this is rising to the level, the top levels of our organization here, as well as across the country. With that, I don't really want to take up more of your time. I want to introduce the two speakers who will really get into the issue. Sara and Geertruyden is the executive director of the Partnership to Improve Patient Care, PIPC, also chaired by former Congressman Tony Coelho, original author of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Tony. Sara joined PIPC in January 2011. Her work is focused on policies to advance patient-centered health system, from patient engagement and research to driving outcomes that matter to patients in healthcare payment and delivery. Something that's near and dear to my heart from my past career. Carly Myers is a staff attorney with the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, a national cross-disability law and policy center that protects and advances the civil and human rights of people with disabilities through legal advocacy, training, education, development of legislation and policy. Carly's work with DREDF over the past 5 years has primarily focused on increasing non-discriminatory access to healthcare, reducing healthcare disparities for low-income persons with disabilities. Prior to joining DREDF, it's quite an acronym, Carly worked with the legal aid organizations across the country and also in clinical healthcare setting, where she was exposed to systemic problems within the healthcare system and how it particularly disadvantages people with chronic conditions. With that, Sara, Carly, I send it over to you.
Thank you. Well, I think I'm assigned to go first. John, I really appreciate that introduction and in particular highlighting that, there's a new study on the horizon for ICER, and maybe I can touch on that a little bit during my discussion. But and I will say it's an honor to precede DREDF in this discussion, because admittedly, a lot of the work that we do, we've learned from them in terms of kind of getting into the nitty gritty of what is it that makes the QALY discriminatory. And so I'm really excited for Carly's presentation too. Is it possible to put my slides up on the screen? I don't think they're up yet.
Yes, let me pull those up for you.
Thank you.
You are very welcome.
If I was better at technical things, I would do it myself, but I'm not.
Can you see them?
I can now. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, so thanks to everybody for joining us today. And thank you, John, for also you providing that summary of what's going on in Connecticut. You know, we're always happy as PIPC to help educate, bring some understanding to state advocates about what some of the emerging issues are. And, you know, this issue of QALYS is complicated. And so I hope that when we get to the end of this, if anybody has questions that, you know, I know if I can't answer the question, hopefully Carly can. But in terms of an introduction to PIPC, we are a coalition that started in 2008, 2009, when some of you may remember comparative effectiveness research was a hot topic on Capitol Hill. In that debate, there was funding that was put forward to identify research priorities. And then there was a big debate about creating a research institute, which ended up becoming PIPC. And our coalition really fought for that. We wanted an independent research entity that sort of had this balance between what the right and the left wanted, that had 3 seats on the Board of Governors for patients and people with disabilities. And within that statute, and this is kind of what we'll be talking a lot about today, within that statute is an explicit bar on the use of this metric, the quality adjusted life year. Not only is PIPC barred from using it as part of their studies, but it's also barred from use by Medicare in making decisions. Next slide. And so the chair of PIPC, who some of you may be familiar with, is Tony Coelho. Tony is a former congressman from California who was also the original author of the Americans with Disabilities Act. For those of you who don't know Tony's story, in fact, I can share with you a podcast afterwards if you're interested that he just recently did. When every time I hear him speak, I feel like I learned something new. But you know, Tony comes at this from a very heartfelt place. When he was diagnosed with epilepsy, it was in a moment where he was actually wanting to go into the seminary to become a priest. And the Catholic Church essentially said, you can't become a priest because you have epilepsy. And at that time, it's been changed since then. There was such a stigma around epilepsy that there was actually a law, I guess a code on the books in the Catholic Church that said that if you have epilepsy, you're possessed by the devil. And so, you know, his parents believed this as Catholics. He had to check the epilepsy box every time he filled out a job application. And, you know, and so he knows, I think probably better than anyone, or as much as anyone, I shouldn't say better than anyone, the stigma that goes along with having a disability that can really, you know, really can impact your quality of life. And so that was, you know, the place he came from that made him a disability advocate and drove him to author the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then later to chair the partnership to improve patient care. Next slide. Quality adjusted life years. Okay. So now QALYS, and I know this is a very complicated issue, and hopefully, you know, Carly and I may be a little bit duplicative, but I do think it's worth doing this. The quality adjusted life year is a metric that is often used in cost effectiveness analysis. And it is, as the National Council on Disability would say, it's discriminatory both in its design and in its impact. If you look at it, the one on here on this side is perfect health. The 0 over here is death. And usually when you live with a disabling condition, you fall somewhere in the middle. And that number represents what your value is in a year lived in the life of that person with that condition. Next slide. And so this, I think, articulates it a little bit more clearly. And so I think what John said in his discussion before we started about ALS, which is the next drug to be studied with this metric, ALS actually has a health utility that's defined as a state worse than death. And so I think that's going to make this study very controversial potentially. And then if you look at, you know, sort of the 0 over here and the 1 over here, you know, I usually use MS as an example because it falls sort of right there in the middle at a 0.5. You think about, you assign a value to a person's life, and then you think about how many more years that person would live in with that condition in that state. And that's part of what goes into this calculation. And the QALY it's controversial for a lot of reasons, right? So you could take someone with spinal muscular atrophy at a 0.2 and raise their quality of life, say, to a 0.4, or you could take someone with a peanut allergy at a 0.8 and raise them to a 1. From a quality of life improvement standpoint, those two things would look a lot alike. But there's also a lot of evidence and research that taking someone from a 0.2 to a 0.4, is a really meaningful health improvement for someone who otherwise has such a low quality of life in terms of whether they can get up and move around. But if you ask somebody how they would define their quality of life, they probably would not necessarily say they have a low quality of life, because they're living their best life as long as they have the accommodations to do so. And so these metrics, I think, get caught up in a lot of stigma and a lot of assumptions about how people value their own lives and how other people value other people's lives. Next slide. So the fundamental problems with the QALY are, and this is just trying to summarize it, extending disabled life then becomes worth less than extending non-disabled life. So you're looking at that 0.5 versus a 1, right? Also, the process of translating those numbers into utility scores often results in a loss of information. So when those utility scores come about by someone saying, okay, do I have mild, moderate, or severe MS? Well, most people would not define their health in the context of mild, moderate, or severe. People typically have a perspective about their quality of life that is much more nuanced. Also, people with disabilities would attribute values to their own health states that are probably different than what we would get from population-based surveys. And so these health utilities are informed by surveys of the general population that say, how would you feel if you were living in this state or that state? Well, someone who's never been in that state probably can't imagine being in that state or really say what their quality of life would be like in that state. These population-based surveys that are used to inform the health utilities, I think, really do also create a problem in terms of that stigma. And then quality-based value assessment is unlikely to account for clinical knowledge on patient variation that's not yet in the research literature. And so this one's getting at the fact that the data points that then go into calculating a quality adjusted life year typically come from clinical trials that don't necessarily reflect what clinicians know from their practice. It takes many years for that kind of information to make it into the research literature. And so a doctor may say, regardless of what I'm seeing in the research literature, this is what I'm seeing in real life and real practice. But yet somebody could have their treatment denied based on just what's in the research literature. Next slide. The other really dramatic impact, I think, in terms of the QALY is kind of gets back to that last point, which is equity. When you base a QALY-based model on randomized clinical trial data that lack minority participants, then you're not getting a whole picture. And you're missing a whole bunch of, like, what we now, I guess, call social determinants of health, right? The evidence that differential triggers like pollution and food insecurity have on the expression of disease and illness. But this has been and I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this, but this has been a big issue in the health equity space that we've got to do a better job of making sure that the data that is feeding these kinds of, whether it's clinical or cost effectiveness studies, the data's got to be more representative. And right now it's, by and large, it has not been. Next slide. So as I mentioned in the beginning, in the Affordable Care Act, when Congress created PIPC, they included a provision that essentially said that Medicare could not use the QALY as a threshold to determine coverage, reimbursement, or incentive programs. Next slide. But this issue goes back much further than 2010, right? Section 504 of the Rehab Act ensured that individuals with disabilities would not be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or otherwise be subjected to discrimination under any program offered by any executive agency, including Medicare. And then, of course, that was extended in the Americans with Disabilities Act when it passed in 1990. And it's an interesting history because then in 1992, the state of Oregon was submitting to CMS. This is when they were initially submitting their waiver application. And in that waiver application, they said, we want to use the quality adjusted life year as the benchmark for what we will put on our prioritized list of services. Now, keep in mind in Oregon, their prioritized list of services is exclusive. It's either covered or it's not, and there's no appeals process. And it's not a medical necessity measurement, right? It's what's most important to cover. What do we think isn't so important to cover? They have a line, and they were going to use the quality adjusted life year to draw that line. Well, the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, which is the administration where the ADA passed, said, no, you can't do that. If you use that kind of cost effectiveness standard to create your prioritized list of services, it would violate the Americans with Disabilities Act. We're not going to let you do that. And so, so if you think about it, right, we have a 30-year history now with the QALY and with the disability community fighting it. Next slide. So now in 2019, the National Council on Disability actually took this issue up as part of a series of reports that they did, and focusing explicitly on the quality adjusted life year. And in this report, they made a series of recommendations that called on both administratively, they called for rulemaking that made it more clear that QALYs were subject to disability rights laws, and they made recommendations to Congress that they should not rely on the QALY in terms of how they covered or reimbursed for healthcare services. And also, since 2019, the National Council on Disability has numerous times gone back to Congress and said, for instance, with the House HR 3 bill, they've said, we are concerned that bill has potential implications for using the quality adjusted life year. And then most recently in the BBA bill, the Build Back Better bill, National Council on Disability went back to Congress and asked for a more unambiguous QALY ban that would cross all provisions, all federal programs, including Medicaid. Next slide. So the reason that we care about this issue goes back to what John was saying at the beginning around ICE, or the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. This is an entity that in recent years, I say recent years, it's been probably 10 plus years that they have really been churning out cost effectiveness analysis studies on drugs that are just coming to market. They call QALYs the gold standard. They're very clear that they think that QALYs are the best way to measure cost effectiveness of treatments. And their reports are really tailored for use by then payers, private insurers, others as a reference point for what they will or will not cover, and the extent to which they will impose those products to utilization management. So think prior authorization, step therapy, those kinds of things. We have a lot of concerns about the way that ICER does its work because it relies on the QALY. Their engagement with stakeholders often doesn't translate that information into the base case scenario of what they determine to or to not be cost effective, doesn't always consider outcomes that matter to patients, et cetera. Next slide. And the reason that we really care about this is because, as I mentioned with Oregon, if you use QALYs as a benchmark, then you're going to impact access to care. Next slide. And we also see that when these metrics are used in other countries, and other countries do rely on QALYs by and large, we often find that we have less access to care, particularly for more disabling conditions. Next slide. So the reason that we wanted to talk to you today too is in reference to these two. There's these two types of bills that we're actually seeing pop up in all of the, not all the states, but in a lot of the states. One is to reference Canadian prices and state programs. Those Canadian prices are determined through the use of the quality adjusted life year. And we've seen a tremendous amount of access to care challenges, particularly with conditions like cystic fibrosis, where patients have not been able to get access. And then States are also looking at drug pricing review boards or affordability boards, where they would create a board, determine use a process of referencing ICER or other cost effectiveness analyses to determine which drugs need to be then subjected to an upper payment limit. Next slide. And so we see states using cost effectiveness and value with tight budgets. They're looking at one size fits all solutions. So New York is using ICER. We see it happening in Massachusetts, where their Health Policy Commission actually has a contract with ICER. And we've got stories from advocates in Massachusetts where their products have not been covered based on an ICER study. Oregon right now is looking to renew its waiver. And we have uncovered that it looks like they are still using QALYS in determining their prioritized list of services. So we anticipate that being an issue. And in Washington State, they have a health technology clinical committee that's making coverage determinations using QALYS as well. Next slide. And so one of the big lessons learned that we've had in the States is, when we would love to see QALY bans everywhere. Oregon actually did create a prescription drug affordability board last year. And in the Oregon bill, they actually comprehensively barred QALYs from use by the board. Colorado had a similar bill where they, I would say, partially barred the use of the QALYs. And we see Washington State and Mexico sort of following that model. And then in Maryland and in Maine, they actually have boards that don't have a QALY ban in them. And so we've actually seen ICER go and present to those boards about how to leverage their studies. And so that's also created a lot of concern. Next slide. And I'm happy to share this, but we have a template bill that a group in what we call Value Our Health pulled together. Value Our Health is a group of organizations representing patients and people with disabilities. And I think that the legislation that you're looking at in Connecticut touches on the QALY ban, which is the third bullet. In Massachusetts, there is legislation that's been introduced that also addresses the standards for patient-centeredness and the appeals. And I think the appeals and physician override mechanisms is in that bill as well. Next slide. So I'm going to stop here and let Carly go, because I want to make sure that she has an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the more legal implications of use of QALYs and how they violate civil rights laws.
Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate the incredibly helpful background that you gave on the use of QALYs in the U.S. healthcare system and how it particularly devalues the lives of people with disabilities. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let's see. It worked great. So I want to dig a little deeper into exactly how the use of the QALY, or exactly how the QALY is calculated, how it is used by pharmaceutical decision makers, and how it impacts the lives of people with disabilities. Sorry, I'm just trying to make my Zoom screen readable. Here we go. So first, I just wanted to give a little background about my organization, the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. DREDF is a national law and policy center that protects and advances the civil and human rights of people with disabilities across contexts. One of our focus areas is health equity. As an organization that is led by and primarily composed of people with disabilities, we are intimately aware of the physical and programmatic barriers that disabled people face when trying to access needed healthcare. We've been very actively involved in the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. We are constantly advocating for improvements to the Medicaid and Medicare programs, as well as private health insurance policies. And our policy staff regularly engages in qualitative research documenting the pervasive barriers that disabled people face when trying to access basic healthcare, in-home supports and services, or even devices as simple as a wheelchair or a CPAP machine, which are often excluded from coverage by health insurance plans. In 2019, the National Council on Disability commissioned DREDF, the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law, and the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network to develop a series of bioethics reports that analyze the intersection with disability, including the report that Sara alluded to regarding the discriminatory use of the QALYS. Kind of building on that report, in fall of last year, we published a more legal focused report with PIPC that analyzes how the QALYS violate non-discrimination law, and specifically the ADA section 504 and our newer cause of action within the healthcare context, section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. Next, I want to talk about like, what is the QALY? How is it actually calculated? Because it's a very confusing concept that, quite frankly, it took me a long time to actually wrap my head around. The QALY is a metric used by the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, or ICER, to measure the therapeutic value of specific drugs and treatments relative to their cost. So ICER is an organization that specializes in clinical cost effectiveness analyses. Health insurers around the country rely on ICER's reports when deciding whether to cover a pharmaceutical drug in the first place, and if they are to cover it, then with what utilization management techniques. So for example, with what cost sharing. In theory, the QALY is intended to reflect two main factors. The first is life extension, and the second is improvements in quality of life. The problem is that these measures take into account subjective opinions on quality of life and thus reflect widespread biases about it, particularly for people with disabilities. To understand how this happens, I want to take a close look at how the QALY is calculated for a particular health state. And I'm just going to walk through an example here. So calculating the QALY. The QALY is a system dependent on some measure of quality of life. ICER determines an aggregated quality of life numeral and then adjusts, or rather devalues, that numeral by a utility weight. So what does that mean? What does it look like? Here's a chart. The QALY assigns life to a particular health state a decimal number between 0 and 1. 1 year of perfect health would equal 1 QALY. Being dead would equal 0 QALY. A year with anything less than perfect health would typically result in a QALY score somewhere between 0 and 1. So how is this in between calculated? The QALY uses a system of utility weights that are associated with particular health states. While there are different techniques used to assign this utility weight to a particular health state, the most common is a survey that is sent out to the general public of the country in which you live that asks 5 questions related to mobility, self-care, usual activities, pain and discomfort, and anxiety and mental health. The most common survey that is used in the United States is called the EuroQual 5-dimensional, or the EQ5D. So I just want to run through an example of that survey. And I'm just going to use my own functional abilities as we walk through this and come up with what my utility weight is. So here we have the EQ5D. The first question relates to mobility. The 3 options are: I have no problems in walking about, I have some problems in walking about, or I am confined to bed. I have no problems in walking about, so I check that box, and on the back end, that would give me a utility weight of 0. The second question, self-care. I have no problems with self-care, I have some problems washing or dressing myself, and I am unable to wash and dress myself. For me, I have no problems with self-care, so I check that box. On the back end, my utility weight is 0. The third question, usual activities. The 3 options are: I have no problems with performing my usual activities, I have some problems, or I'm unable to perform my usual activities. For me, I have some problems performing my usual activities. So on the back end, that would give me a negative 0.5. The fourth question, pain and discomfort. I have no pain or discomfort. I have moderate pain or discomfort. I have extreme pain or discomfort. I have extreme pain or discomfort, so I check that box, and on the back end, that gives me a -1. My utility weight is dropping. The fifth and final question on the 5D is related to anxiety and depression. The survey asks whether you are anxious. The three options are: I'm not anxious or depressed, I am moderately anxious or depressed, or I'm extremely anxious or depressed. For me, I'm moderately anxious or depressed. So I check that box and I get a negative 0.5. The survey then averages out your answers. So for here, my total negative utility weight is 2.0. You divide that by 5 questions. My average utility weight is negative 0.4. So now let's plot that utility weight onto the QALYS scale. The 1 QALY is subtracted by the 0.4 utility weight, meaning that I have a QALY score of 0.6. My life is worth 40% less than others because of my disabilities. Now, it's important to note here that this system of assigning utility weights and QALYs to a particular health state is not individualized. These surveys are given to people across the country, and the data is then aggregated in order to come up with a numeral of quality of life with that is associated with certain health conditions. It is not, for example, given to a particular patient when determining whether or not they are to be prescribed a particular pharmaceutical drug. The takeaway from all of this is that life with a disability is given a lower QALY score, a score that is calculated from surveys that measure a society's perception of quality of life, which can and does incorporate biases, instead of from individuals' evaluations of their own condition and their own quality of life. For some people, this particular level of disability is considered so severe under their particular level of disability is considered so severe under this QALYS framework that they receive a QALY score of less than 0, suggesting that their life is considered worse than death. Unsurprisingly, many people with disabilities disagree with this assessment. The lower the QALY score on people with a certain disability, the higher the cost that ICER will place on any drug used within that population. That's the bottom line. This is because ICER is concerned about the cost value of pharmaceuticals. And if your QALY score, which is in large part based on perceived quality of life, is lower than 1, then ICER says that you have less value than a person without a disability, which means that in order to have cost effectiveness, ICER needs to place a higher price on pharmaceuticals intended for you. So let's run through a specific example. Let's talk about the drug Trikafta. The Trikafta is a drug that is used to treat cystic fibrosis, which, as you probably know, is a genetic disease that causes thickened mucus, which progressively blocks an individual's respiratory and digestive systems and eventually causes death. Until recently, there were no drugs on the market to effectively treat CF. There were really only treatments for its symptoms. In 2019, building on several more modest CF treatments approved in the years prior, the FDA approved the drug Trikafta, which actually partially restores functioning of the defective protein that causes CF and offers a dramatic improvement over all prior options available to treat the condition. While many people with CF have notable functional limitations and may spend a significant amount of time in the hospital each year, they also generally report a high quality of life. Despite all of this, the US Country Survey, or the EQ5D, which we just ran through, severely devalues quality of life with decreased lung function. So this means that ICER inflates the cost of the drug Trikafta dramatically. So my question for you is, at what cost per QALY do you think that the ICER rates the drug Trikafta? The answer is over $1 million. ICER states that based on its calculations of the QALY as applied to this population, the cost of Trikafta should be over $1 million for each year of life extension gained. What does this mean on on the payer side, on the insurer side. This means that health insurance companies that cover pharmaceutical drugs, who often look to ICER's assessments and reports when deciding whether or not to cover a certain drug, either will not cover that drug, or they will impose incredibly high cost sharing on the individual. And for people with disabilities who also disproportionately live in poverty because of systemic issues that cause them to stay in poverty, they often can't afford it. So for Trikafta, this hugely inflated assessment of how much the drug is quote unquote worth makes it less likely that payers will cover the drug in the first place. And if they do, they will likely impose really high cost sharing burdens on the people who need it. This creates an access to care barrier for people with CF, leaving many without effective long-term care options. This is an example of disability discrimination. The Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act all prohibit discrimination in healthcare programs and activities. There are really two forms of discrimination that are at issue here. And you can feel free to, after this presentation, I'm sure we'll share the report that DREDF produced on this issue that dives really much deeper into how the use of the QALY is discriminatory. But here I just wanted to summarize the two main cause of actions that an individual could pursue in this context. So first, case precedent says that healthcare insurers may not target for exclusion treatments that are a proxy for disability. So here, by relying on pricing structures that use the QALY, health insurers are targeting pharmaceutical drugs that are uniquely needed by people with disabilities. Trikafta is the perfect example. Only people with CF need Trikafta. It is so closely associated with the disability of CF that by targeting this drug for exclusion, or by placing heightened utilization management criteria on it, insurers are discriminating on the basis of disability. Second, case precedent says that healthcare policies and practices cannot have a discriminatory effect on people with disabilities. And specifically, policies cannot deny meaningful access to a healthcare benefit. Here, pricing structures that use the QALY disproportionately burden people with disabilities. They make pharmaceutical drugs that people with disabilities uniquely rely on more expensive, meaning that not only do people with disabilities not have affordable access to the treatment that they need, but their equal participation in their communities is also intimately impacted by their failure to receive adequate health care. So this too is disability discrimination. Thank you for listening. That's all that I have for my presentation, but I am here and very open to questions.
Well, and this is Sara, and I will knit. Carly, that was an amazing. I'm going to have you do my QALY 101 from now on, because that was really helpful. Even, just the way that you explained it and put it in context, I thought was really useful. I welcome other people to ask questions. I'm sure Carly is going to be more useful than I am.
This is John. I'd actually like to ask a question, since ICER announced their review today of the Amylyx drug, and they expect their review to be done by the end of September of this year. But public comment finishes up, I believe, the end of this month. So they only give a few weeks for the public to comment. And it's been said in the past that this is how ICER says that the public, the patients, and the physicians are allowed to be part of the process. How true is that? And how true is the weight of value given to the public comments, particularly from the patients and physicians across the board?
I'm happy to start this one and welcome feedback from any others who've been involved in ICER studies. The feedback that we get over time, it varies really by study. In some studies, we'll get feedback from the patient groups that have engaged that they do feel like they moved the needle, and others will say that they didn't. I think the real problem, and I mentioned this, I think, when I was speaking, is ICER will get feedback from patient groups. I think they've done a better job of incorporating patient feedback into their contextual analysis. But it's not often incorporated into what we call the base case for cost effectiveness analysis. So, think about the spinal muscular atrophy study comes to mind because, one of the things that the advocates were really pushing for was better consideration of caregiving and caregiving costs, right? And ICER is very limited in terms of what kind of data they will use to capture those kinds of outcomes that matter to patients that then would inform the utility weights and the, what they would define as being clinical or cost effective. And so, yeah, I think it depends. I mean, I will say, I think in the contextual analyses, perhaps they're getting better, but in the base case of what is or is not cost effective and in the context of what kind of utilization management they push forward, perhaps not so much. But I think it's important for you to engage because, at the end of the day, it's tough. I think some advocates will say, we don't want to give them credibility. They're not a federal agency, but they're influencing decisions. And, so engaging is, I think you have to engage, otherwise they won't have any of that data on what matters to patients.
Yeah, I will say that we are engaging, including engaging our own economists at the association. So we will be engaging with ICER at a heavy level. I was just curious as to your historical understanding of how that is taken by ICER, and your differentiation is appreciated because I think that gets to part of the issue here with ICER's overall. The base way that they assess it isn't changing.
Yeah, watch for the policy recommendations. That's something that people don't often think about because they have policy recommendations at the end that get into the utilization management stuff.
So I've got a question. First of all, thank you. I wasn't even aware that there was a bill in Maine until I got an email about this forwarded just yesterday from the AUCD. I'm the USA director in Maine, and I would like to engage. I've already reached out to the sponsor of the Maine bill to ask him what he thinks alternatives to QALYS would be. The Maine bill is about holding down drug costs, which is I know a priority of the sponsor. Because I know that's at least important to the sponsor, I'm thinking about what are credible alternatives to using QALYS. I understand that Medicare is barred from using QALYS, and I'm thinking about, not having dug into this research except for in the case of triage for at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. The thoughts that occur to me are, what evidence is there that you can successfully hold down drug costs without using QALYS? And maybe that's in your model bill, and I'm not sure. It sounds like the model bill is about banning QALYS. So I'm thinking about coming to the table with offering credible alternatives. So that if the committee wants to pass something, they don't pass something that's going to be discriminatory. That they pass something that's going to be non-discriminatory. Yeah, I guess that's really the key question about what are alternatives that are as specific as possible, and what evidence do we have that those might actually still achieve the aim of holding the drug costs.
So this is Carly. I don't think that there's a perfect answer or a perfect alternative. There have been a few different measures proposed as an alternative. I think all of them are better than the use of the QALY. You can take a look at the report that DREDF produced, which I just linked in the chat to get further details on them. But some of the alternative metrics that have been suggested are known as there's the equal value of life years gains, the EVLYG, which differs from the QALY in that it only considers quantity of life extension that a drug or a treatment affords an individual without discounting on the basis of utility weights. However, by doing this, it also affords no value at all to quality of life improvements or symptom reduction from the drug. So it might have a limited usefulness in evaluating the value of treatments. There's also been a suggestion of what's known as the health years in total, HYT. This approach is pretty similar to the QALY, but it separates out the evaluations of life extension and quality of life improvement. It only uses utility values to discount the latter, so discounting quality of life. This approach is better than the QALY because it does eliminate one discriminatory component, but it does still rely on the same discriminatory utility weights for purposes of quality of life improvement. So it's also not perfect. And then finally, the third big proposal that I have researched is the efficiency frontier, or the EF. This method benchmarks the price of a new drug to the value of existing drugs, specifically benchmarking particular outcomes that existing drugs have on a particular condition in order to calculate a cost per outcome unit. The advantage of this is obviously that it eliminates the quality-based utility values completely. However, it doesn't allow for comparisons across conditions. And by relying on an existing benchmark drug, a new drug might be over or undervalued depending on recent pharmaceutical innovation or a lack thereof. So those are like the three major categories of alternatives that I have been made aware of. None of them are perfect. I think all of them are better than the QALY. And I would love to also, if anyone has ideas of, if we could have a brainstorming session of how to solve this problem, I would very much invite that.
I appreciate that, because I mean, I did notice on the example of the CF drug, like the cost per life year gained was even higher than the cost per per QALY. So I'm thinking if you take, I almost feel like the issue is, number one, that you're discounting a life lived with disability. That's clearly a problem. But the other thing is that if you're measuring quality with this survey of the general population, you ought to be asking people with the conditions what matters to them, and that way you can capture a drug that improves their quality of life as defined by them.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like there is not currently a metric that captures that. Is that right?
I would only point, the Innovation in Bio Initiative is trying to do this with multi-criteria decision analysis. And so what they've done is they've tried to create other criteria besides QALYs, and trying to do a better, like they actually have a depression model that they just came out with, where they actually did do that. They went and they talked to the patients. I mean, their goal has been to really help inform this. How do you improve the utility weights? How do you get the better data that you need in order for those to because right now what's used in a QALY, it's I always say it's junk in, it's junk out. When you have bad data feeding a model, whatever the model is, if the data is not great, the outcome's not going to be great. And I think one of the things that we've been pushing for a lot is that we need to improve the data, right? We need entities like PIPC doing more outcomes-based research that really captures what matters to patients. PIPC is starting to go down this path of without using a QALY, capturing economic data. So like they're going to be looking specifically at things like caregiving, and hopefully, I hope they come up with a model for how do you capture that kind of cost and analyze it, but without using a QALY, so that then it could be used in downstream, whether it's value assessments or clinical effectiveness research. I mean, but the problem is the fundamental data. I think the data problem, we just have a data problem underneath all this. Yeah.
Thanks to you both.
Yeah, I think that matches up. I mean, sorry, you've been there, but that's how they changed Medicare. That's and changing how they paid physicians, right? In the Medicare system in 2014, 2015, it was the move to that data source. And there were certain physician specialties that had their own data and clinical data that allowed them to have better outcomes and produce best practices, and as well as use it economically. I think it's incumbent upon disease groups and patient advocacy groups to sort of understand and figure out how we can start to do that. I know that was one of the big things that we're going to be looking at here at the ALS Association, is how do we get a better data set and a better understanding of ALS patients that's beyond just the basic demographics, because we want to try to get into and dive into the real clinical aspects of what we're doing in order to help provide that data set that would allow us to have a better understanding of when you start layering it on top of the effectiveness of a drug or the cost of a drug, you can start to actually get real results. Because I think that's what worked in the physician work realm, and in changing how physicians and hospitals are paid. So I'm hopeful that we can get to that point, but it's a point well taken.
Well, there's no one better than the patient groups to be leading that work, right? I mean, you have your finger on the pulse.
Do we have any further questions today for John, Sara, or Carly? Well, you've done such an extraordinary job. You've answered everyone's questions. If that's the case, I just would like to say on behalf of BioCT, we want to thank you very much for your expertise and time today discussing this important issue in front of us all. And we will make this replay available very shortly. It will be accessible via the virtual library that is on the BioCT website, but we will also provide a link to anyone who would like to circulate it to family, friends, or colleagues. So I want to thank you very much and wish all good health and to take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.